Hello, this is Rich Spots. I'm speaking to you from Trinity Church, which is in Solebury, Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, just outside of Philadelphia. And today I am finishing the Choral suite from Lord Mystique, Choral number 5, for the 14th Sunday after Pentecost. Because of the instrument's size and expense, in the realm of musical genres, the organ and its repertoire are unusually beholden to institutions, and as such are greatly affected by the caprice of politics, philosophies, and historical events. To that end, I need to take a moment to discuss the cause célèbre that gripped the fin de siècle period, the Dreyfus Affair. The fin de siècle saw the birth of the Third Republic, a government born out of France's ignominious defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. France was a nation in the midst of an existential crisis, and this insecurity made it prone to volatility. Alfred Dreyfus was an Alsatian Jewish artillery officer who was found guilty by the French military of espionage on behalf of their nemesis, the Germans. In fact, he was innocent, and individuals like Émile Zola brought this situation to the fore, seeking to exonerate him. The palpable memory of the German invasion weighed heavily upon the minds of the French, so it was a country filled with fear, suspicion, and paranoia. However, Dreyfus' cultural background indeed played a role in his plight. The 19th century saw the rise of modern anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism was less based upon theological differences than it was upon ideas held by factions within the diverse and complex polities of the then contemporary secular European movements. Nationalism, which sought unity through cultural conformity. Socialism, which sought economic developments and which, in a jaundiced manner, perceived the stereotyped economic activities of Jewish capitalists to be part of the problem, and whose followers felt that it had received instantiation through the banking and Panama Canal scandals of the 1880s. Then, of course, it could be found in atheism and laicism, which sought the societal abnegation of religion in general. And later, it would also be seen in science, which through Darwinism and its derivative offshoot, eugenics, would venture ultimately into the dark realms that would haunt the modern world. I find anti-Semitism to be abhorrent, and merely discussing it makes me uncomfortable. And I believe it is important to engage in acts of reflection upon it to prevent its recurrence. However, it is beyond the capacity of this discussion to go into the issue with the depth that it deserves. However, anti-Semitism was the unsettling undercurrent behind the Dreyfus Affair, and it needs to be acknowledged. That said, Tournemire was not a known subscriber to anti-Semitic beliefs. He was a follower of the Catholic mystic Léon Blois, who railed against the anti-Semitism of his times. Tournemire, later in life, repeatedly spoke out against the Nazism that was burgeoning during the 1930s, both in his correspondences and in his memoirs. And of course, there was the fact that his second wife was Jewish. In fact, after Tournemire's death in 1939, Madame Tournemire became a member of the French resistance during World War II. Adopting the nom de guerre Madame de Champs, She would secret resistance documents in amongst Tournemire's music scores. Returning to the Dreyfus Affair. As is the case with any cause célèbre, the issue that sparked the furor was not the ultimate issue of fury. Today, I am filming this video during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. While someone in the future may surmise that we must have been obsessing over how to abate a disease, we are, in fact, dealing with other societal problems such as race, the bane and blessings of the American belief in freedom, etc. Every cause in our society is seeing its own issues through the lens of COVID. And most people are seeing the world in a simplistic, naive, and error-riddled narrative of left versus right. The Dreyfus Affair suffered the same fate. At the time of the fin de siècle, the Third Republic was vociferously anti-Catholic. However, this had a long history in France. Religious institutions had been under the thumb of the state since the time of the Revolution and later the Napoleonic Concordat of 1801, with church finances, property, and ecclesiastical appointments being controlled by the government. Then, anti-religious sentiment erupted anew with the Paris Commune in 1871, which followed the Franco-Prussian War. During the Bloody Week, when the French government laid siege to Paris, Archbishop Darbois of Paris, along with other priests, were executed by the communards, and attempts were made to burn down Notre Dame. The anti-Catholic legislation of the Third Republic, the government which sprang from the calamitous Franco-Prussian War and Paris Commune, had become particularly acute. It was also during this period that Auguste Comte's anti-theological materialist philosophy, positivism, was garnering cachet. So the Church at that time was facing very real, well-founded, vincible fears. Through the Dreyfus Affair, what began as the plight of an innocent man in the hands of a corrupt military turned into a cultural war, and the Church would pay the price. After a decade of wrangling, Dreyfus was found guilty, because to say otherwise would be to impugn the military. France had a system of conscription, which deeply engendered esteem for the army in the hearts of its citizens. So one would be more likely to find a Frenchman who believed in the military than one who believed in God. It was deemed that the Dreyfus Affair would be the perfect impetus to address the conflict between the Church and the state. The Assumptionist order was a vociferously anti-Dreyfusard faction within the diverse and complex polity of the Catholic Church, and they received much attention in the press. The perspective of this subgroup would be rendered as evidence to legitimize what was to come. Firstly, President Émile Loubet granted Dreyfus a pardon, but he did so in such a way as to clear the military of wrongdoing. To further add to the intrigue, during this time, France saw the Affaire des Fiches, whereby illegal surveillance forms detailing the religious views of military officers were gathered. Those whose beliefs and affiliations did not conform to the Republican perspective were put on blacklists. This cultural abstersion, which ostensibly sought to reform the military because of universal male conscription, was, in fact, a device to transform society at large. Then, through the Act of Separation in 1905, church schools were closed, church property and many assets were confiscated, and monasteries and convents forcibly were banished, launching a kind of diaspora. This included communities like the famed monastery of Salem, who specialized in liturgical and Gregorian chant studies. While the church now was allowed to have control of its finances, what remained was an eviscerated institution. It would not be until after the Great War a decade later, when the church would be called upon to bury the millions who had died, that the perspectives of the Third Republic and Comte's positivism would be called into question. Through the Great War, there resulted a rapprochement between the church and secularist factions. With this rapprochement, monasteries like Salem were allowed to return, and the church moved from trauma to healing. And it is no coincidence that l'orgue mystique would begin to take shape in the 1920s with the end of this diaspora, this Babylonian captivity. I believe it is important to discuss this topic because the Dreyfus Affair and the Act of Separation occurred just as Tournemire was coming of age and beginning to work in the church. As was the case for the Jewish people during the Babylonian captivity, through the alembic of trials and vicissitudes, belief and faith can become distilled and mature, suddenly becoming clear and deeply profound. In many ways, this crisis shaped Tournemire's music and gave it focus. As many do, Tournemire engaged in the contrasting but not incongruous notion of both being a child of one's time while yet reacting against it. Tournemire received his initial education during the crepuscular phase of Romanticism. Yet, through the artistic movements of the fin de siècle period, which served as a reaction to the Dreyfus Affair, the Symbolist, the Rose-Croix, and Tsar Paladin, along with the Catholic mystics Joris Karl Huysmans, Ernest Hello, and Léon Blois, Tournemire's music would move beyond the 19th century romantic, emotive, religious sentiment of his organ teacher, César Franck, to a 20th century erudite theological understanding that wedded the heart and the intellect, a Franckian post-Romanticism. Today I am performing the fifth chorale from l'orgue mystique. The piece's subject matter is taken from the Graduale Bonum est confidere in Domino. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put any confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put any confidence in princes. It expounds upon the gospel pericope for the day, which is taken from Matthew. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Here, we are called to overcome that which allures and beguiles us in our popular culture. For all of its excitement and pleasures, it is these values which drive us to hurt one another. We are to consider the lilies of the field and to adopt a life of simplicity and beauty. We are to seek, first and foremost, a divine kingdom. We are not to be fixated upon the mercurial obsessions of our generation, but are to have an eternal vision of life, a transcendent vision of history, an understanding of our lives in that context. We must attempt to understand the way of things in conspectu Dei. Only then will goodness reign. So that said, here is Choral number 5 for the 14th Sunday after Pentecost.